intrusive for the car share operators, as well as considerations for how to right size the coverage areas, whether citywide or if it's narrowed from that, and a simplified flat rate pricing. You should know that right now, or during the pilot program, we were doing invoicing based on meter recovery, so we'd have to track each vehicle, where they parked, how long they parked, and assess a meter rate for that. Very time-intensive and labor-intensive approach to invoicing for these. So we're proposing a more simplified flat rate and low overhead approach to managing it. And then a consideration, too, for how do we manage the number of vehicles if there's a need for it. So our next steps, and we're actually in the process now of developing a policy that we can propose to the council, and we should have a draft ready very soon. We're also, of course, in the process. We'll have to see if it's worthy of a resolution, or if it's going to need an ordinance process, so it'll have to have legal review and such. If a resolution, we'd be able to bring back to this committee a proposal in the next month or so that would encompass that policy. And for a March 1st implementation when the current car share contracts expire. If it needs an ordinance process, the timeline that you see indicates the earliest possibilities for promulgating that ordinance. That's all I have right now. Thank you.
No, thank you. Any questions per the presentation? Councilmember Gordon.
I have a couple questions, and one of them has to do with the issue of state taxes, and I was curious about how the state treats car sharing. It seems to me that car sharing is a little bit similar to limousine service and taxi cabs, but also to rent-a-cars, and I'm just not sure where the state's decided to put them in terms of taxing or how they're treating the car sharing entities. And you mentioned they're concerned about how high the taxes are from the state. So maybe you can give me a little more information on that.
Yes, sir. Chairman Wright, Councilmember Gordon. My understanding of it is that they're essentially treated as rental car companies, and the taxation that goes with that, the bulk of that is as a rental car company, and then, of course, the sales tax on top of that.
Okay.
Does that answer adequately?
It is, but then, so I'm assuming that rental car companies have a higher tax rate than taxi, for example, or limos, or is there any comparison?
Yes, Chairman Wright, Councilmember Gordon. I don't know all of those other rates. I know that in this case, there's approximately 22% tax onto the top of whatever the rental rate is for those car share companies. I'm not really aware of what the taxis or limousines are paying, depending on where they're dropping off and picking up.
Okay. And I don't know if Mr. Ranieri wants to add anything to that. But he came up behind you when I asked the question.
No, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Gene Ranieri. I'm the Director of Government Relations. This is an issue at the legislature. It is, Mr. Cieminski is right. It is considered to be a rental car. So you pay the sales tax, the regular sales tax, and I think right now it's a little bit the state sales tax and local sales taxes. On top of that is a special tax, I think 9.5% for rental cars. And on top of that is a 5% surcharge. So it adds up to about 22, 23% for a rental car. However, if you are a nonprofit operating a car service, you don't pay the 5% surcharge. So it's a little less.
And do we have, is our car a nonprofit, or is there not? So one of our.
I think one of them is. I think it is.
Yes, sir.
It's our car, so they would have a differential of 5%.
And we don't know how that can, and so if you're a limousine service, you just have you pay a sales tax on that, and that's it? Do we know?
Mr. Chairman, Councilmember Gordon, I have to get back to you on that. I really don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, and they're fairly different from a limousine service as they don't have a driver. So that's interesting. The last thing I wanted to ask about, as you're developing the policy, and I think that I saw this in the slides, are you looking at incentives if companies do provide citywide service, or how you can incentivize them to help providing services to areas of the city where they might not otherwise if they were just relying kind of on the market?
It's Chair Wright, Councilmember Gordon. We did discuss incentives, but nothing specific has been proposed by any of the car share operators. We're looking at what other cities are doing, and we have some other approaches that can be considered, but we'll also have to determine when these areas are established where there may be the need to actually somehow incentivize that. There are other ways of controlling that through the policy in establishing a procedure for putting limitations or requirements on vehicles. In the case of one of the cities, they said that here's the limit on the number of vehicles, but if you serve these underserved areas, we'll let you have more vehicles. In another model, Denver has moved now to requiring each car share operator to include locations for at least 2 vehicles in each of what they call an opportunity area, which is essentially a low-income area. So there are different approaches to doing that, and we're considering all of those as we develop the policy and get further input.
Excellent. I appreciate your exploring those. Thank you.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to echo that. I really appreciate so much more information this time than the last time when we had a very brief presentation. I'm very supportive of us looking at approaches to require or incentivize service in low-income communities, in particular in our city. We have a bit of a dynamic where we'll have to balance service in single-family, lower-density residential parts of the city, where I think it is probably more challenging to provide that point-to-point service. But again, balancing that with making sure that we're not redlining our city and allowing companies to redline in our city. So I really appreciate the thoughtfulness that you're using to approach that balance and looking at the other cities that have taken this on.
Thank you. Councilmember Yang.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to echo the same thing, which is just that, if we continue on with this, that we do our best to cover all areas of Minneapolis, and we have to find innovative ways of doing it. Because certainly, if we took the easy way out, we'd allow these car sharing services just to focus on downtown and call it a day. And so I would urge us not to take the easy way out and do everything we can to see if we can cover all of the city. When you look at the numbers for cars to go in terms of the wards and the number of trips and things like that, I actually was a little bit surprised that Ward 5 wasn't dead last or second to last. We're actually 10th, and 10th is better than 13, I guess, in this. But just to be funny, not anything to joke about necessarily, but in terms of the areas that have the highest usage, you can kind of guess what they were: Ward 3, Ward 7, Ward 10. But when I look at this, I think it would be good for us to incentivize, but also to push these car sharing services to serve areas that are not using so much, and in some ways push them to, figure out how to get folks to use their services. Because I think at the end of the day, when people know about these services and its convenience, I think generally people will use these services. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Any further conversation, questions? Seeing none, I will move to receive and file. Any discussion on that? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Dissenting nay. Thank you for the
Thank
report. We'll now move to our final item, which is a discussion about the rail safety resolution that's before us today. And with that, I'd like to invite Mr. Ranieri from the IGR department to come forward and initiate this conversation with some context and background.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. My name is Gene Ranieri from IGR. When I was in grade school, we were always asked the question, where did oil come from? And that was a geography class, and we always knew it was in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, California, and since I was born on the East Coast, also it started in Pennsylvania. If we ask kids today, where does oil come from? They'll say North Dakota, which would be, I think, a surprise to everyone. And historically, where we have oil, the pipelines took the oil to the refineries on the Gulf Coast and the East Coast. In North Dakota, it's different. What made North Dakota, I think, become an oil center, technology found ways to get the oil that was very difficult to economically get to years ago. So what did it mean? In terms of there had to be a transportation system, and we saw oil being transported from North Dakota to the east and sometimes to the west, but mostly to the east, by train. And it grew dramatically. Transport of oil in this country in 2011, but the number of tank cars was roughly 65,000 to 70,000 tank cars transported oil by rail. In 2014, it was 493,000, or a seven-fold increase. The routes through North Dakota, through Canada, through Minnesota. The Minnesota Department of Transportation was tasked in 2013 by the legislature to come back with a report on where the trains were going, where they were passing through, and what were some of the conditions to improve safety along those routes. They came back and said there were about 700 miles, two major routes, one coming through North Dakota, through Moorhead, down through St. Cloud, through the north part of our city, off to St. Paul, and to the east. The other route comes down through Wilmer, through the western suburbs. MnDOT estimated there were about 7 to 8 trains a day, most of them coming through our city, mostly in the north. Recently now, due to some improvements, and the railroad companies are really trying and are doing improvements for safety and are also aware of the concern of the volatility of this oil. For example, Burlington Northern is spending, BNS is spending around $360 million in improvements in our state on its rail system. Also, in working closely with the federal government and others, the railroad companies and the federal government has working on ways to improve railroad safety, new cars, better tank cars, slower speeds. I think the latest rule that came out had speeds at 40 miles an hour. I think BNSF is at 35 miles an hour voluntarily. There is concerns also about braking systems that railroads that need to do. And the big issue is communication, working closely with local governments, state governments, and telling folks what's being transported, where it's going. And frankly, Mr. Chairman, that's an area that needs some improvement. I know the governor was concerned about this a few weeks ago, and this is an issue that's being worked on. The feds and state governments throughout the country are aware of this. The U.S. Conference of Mayors back in June passed a resolution asking for some federal action, also urging the states, mayors to work closely with railroad companies and the federal government. Our resolution that's here before you today has basically 3 major resolving clauses. One talks about actions working with the federal government in terms of providing some funds, more communications, better protocols, things of that nature. At the state level, funding for passes for highway, railroad intersections and crossings, and also something where we as a city can work closely, hopefully get into a dialogue. I know you were concerned about this, Mr. Chairman, with the railroad companies to discuss such issues as response times, what's being done in the railroad yards. We have 2 major railroad yards in our city. Also about safety issues, what can be done in terms of insurance issues, things of that nature. So this resolution really covers a lot of issues. It is a major national issue. There is a concern right now. We have in here, the trains are often anywhere from a half a mile to a mile long. They go through neighborhoods. Right now they're going through downtown. They're going through sensitive areas in our state. And people need to know that's happening. And that's one of the concerns that's in this resolution. Another thing we're suggesting in this resolution is that the railroad companies, if they can, try and avoid going through downtown, particularly during events at Target Field and Target Center. That is similar to what's being proposed or being suggested by the Seattle City Council. So this resolution embodies an awful lot of facts and figures from the American Railroad Association, federal regulations, discussions with insurance company, with review of insurance issues, and then comes up with some suggestions and ideas to support. The whole idea is to reduce the risk of a major accident. Generally, the transport by rail in this country is very safe, but there is a concern that what would happen if we have an incident in a major urban area similar to what happened in Castleton or in Quebec. So generally, that's the impetus, Mr. Chairman, and I'll stand for any questions.
Before that, you mentioned the activity around nationally with the mayors, and of course our mayor has been very involved in this too. As mayor, when we talk to these different jurisdictions, we know it's such a critical part of a conversation. At the federal level, it really is, Mayor Hodges that has those conversations at that high policy level. As a matter of fact, we had a roundtable a few years ago with the Secretary of Transportation here in the city, and right there we were being represented from the mayor's office. But on a sort of day-to-day, year-in, year-out level, her senior policy director, Peter Wagenius, both in matters of policy and our interface on very significant projects that involve rail, has some insights and experiences that perhaps you could share and be a part of this conversation too.
Mr. Chair, thank you so much. Peter Wagenius, Policy Director for Mayor Hodges. Thank you so much for those words. I just wanted to share a couple of the mayor's observations in support of the action that you're going to take today. Many hands were involved in the writing of this, including most especially Representative Frank Hornstein, the council members, our IGR staff. We got input from Citizens Acting for Rail Safety, who are represented here. Many hands were involved in making sure that this was comprehensive. Let me just identify two of the challenges that we had in writing this resolution. On one hand, we don't want to set the expectation that the city of Minneapolis unilaterally can do anywhere near what we would like to do. On the other hand, we're not powerless, and it's important for us to be part of collective action with other cities. Another challenge is that we want to make sure we're identifying ourselves as part of a nationwide problem, but also that there are some very specific applications to the state of Minnesota and the city of Minneapolis. As Gene Ranieri just pointed out, Governor Dayton recently weighed in a few weeks ago with a letter, and Mayor Hodges said, and I will repeat, Mayor Hodges shares Governor Dayton's concern. The residents of Minneapolis and the businesses and many thousands of visitors in our downtown appreciate his leadership. We join him in urging safer and more responsible behavior from railroads. We did that in appreciation for his work, the governor's leadership, in part because he is recognizing where we are within a national problem, but also calling out some of the specifics that we face right here in Minneapolis. The presence and proximity of Target Center and Target Field to a very, very busy and increasingly busy rail line. The presence of the Mississippi River. These are unique qualities that Minneapolis has that require a unique perspective. And we feel that the language in front of you balances these things. It recognizes that we are part of a nationwide problem. I'll just say that when Representative Hornstein and I took the first stab at drafting a first draft, we looked at resolutions from other cities. There was no shortage of examples for us to look at, and our action that we're taking today is consistent with resolutions from Oakland, California to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and everywhere in between. I would just conclude on the mayor's behalf by thanking Council members Reich, Palmisano, and Bender in particular for their work on this, thanking our IGR staff, thanking Representative Hornstein, thanking CARS. Collective action is how we're going to make a difference on this. The railroads are powerful, and they have unfortunately been effective so far in preventing or delaying actions to protect the public at the federal level. But citizens and cities have power too. Working together, we will make a difference for our city. Working together, we must. And the mayor appreciates our work together and urges a yes vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate how that was summed up in terms of our collective action. Councilmember Glidden.
Thank you. I might invite up Mr. Ranieri. I actually had just a few more particular questions about the construction of the resolution. And so in the first resolved clause, this is the one where it says the city of Minneapolis urges Congress to enact legislation that would enhance railroad safety and reduce risk, and urges the U.S. Department of Transportation to adopt rules that I think that should be enhance railroad safety and decrease risk. And then there's a really particular list underneath that. I was just curious how that list was put together, and I only ask because it's kind of different from the list above from the U.S. Conference of Mayors? And was that from other cities' resolutions, or how did we gather this really particular list?
Mr. Chairman, Councilmember Glidden, we looked at other resolutions. We also read the federal rules that were out there. We also read did a lot of research on the issues, particularly about pipeline. That's right. The Pipeline Safety Administration was involved in this too, and they did a lot of study about tank cars and equipment. So we inserted those issues. So we basically used other cities, League of Cities, as well as our own research and talking to experts.
Okay. Then the next question I just had was, because of this particular list, your phrase was before that was, these are among the actions that the federal government can do. And so I just had a question about that, because it's a little different from how we sometimes frame our resolutions, which are urging a particular action. And maybe this is because this issue has been so challenging, and we're trying to think of how to give more options. But is there a thought that we would give more particular guidance to our federal lobbyists on which of these items perhaps should be prioritized over others, or is the idea to give a lot of flexibility?
Mr. Chairman, Councilmember Glidden, the list was put together. We will sit down and put some of these items into our federal agenda, bring those in. We also will try and get some priority in talking to our lobbyists. Some of these issues are already underway. For example, phase out of tank cars. That is underway. What we're suggesting here is that it appears there may be a possibility that some of the older tank cars can be used in trains that don't fit the definition of what's a highly hazardous, flammable train. We want to get that clarified. In other words, trains carrying more than 30 tank cars of oil or ethanol are subject to the new rules about new tank cars, but we're not certain about other. If you only had like 5 tank cars, we have to get that trying clarified. There's some questions about funding. We'd like to see some more funding from the federal government for railroad crossings and safety. There's a big issue that would probably take lots of discussion, is the insurance issue. How are these catastrophes covered? The railroad companies, the shippers and others, I don't think cover insurance when it's being transported. And there's been some discussion about possibly a system similar to what we do, and I think in the utility industry, particularly with nuclear power and things of that nature, where there's some sort of dollars paid by shippers put into a fund for accidents and incidents. That's an issue that's to be discussed, and that may be something that may be a priority. So we'll look at those and bring those back to during our January discussion. And this is unique because most of the things we talk about are often legislation, but many of the things here are going to be by federal rule through the Department of Transportation or the Federal Railway Administration or the pipeline folks, and I may be missing someone, but Surface Transportation Board. And the Department of Energy, because above there in the resolution, the U.S. Council, the mayor suggests that the study to be done, studying the volatility of oil, should be accelerated by the Department of Energy. So many federal agencies are involved in this.
And if I just may elaborate, that spirit of flexibility that you referenced, Councilmember, certainly was imbued in this to try to best find through the processes that the lobbyists are most familiar with to get some tactical wins and some tactical footholds on this issue.
So then I had a question about the section on, I guess I would call this more about communication with the railroad companies. So that is the second to the third to the last resolve clause, with a list of several items where we would like more or maybe any communication. Has this been sort of and I know there's, again, this kind of gets into this area where we are not alone as a city needing more information for a whole variety of reasons, but not being able to require that communication. So it's one of these tricky areas. has this also been an area that's been reflected in other cities' resolutions? And have there been some railroads that have understood the importance of this kind of communication with cities or other local jurisdictions?
Mr. Chairman, Councilmember Glidden, some of the resolutions do include increased communication. Example, Seattle was working closely with the railroad companies, particularly Burlington Northern. I mentioned Seattle, and we'll say, well, that's on the West Coast, but there's concern that if a port is built, an oil port is built on the West Coast, you could see more oil from North Dakota going through Seattle. They passed a resolution along these lines about communication. I think you saw the same thing. I think Philadelphia did it too. We are seeing some increased communication. Also, our legislature is requiring, as part of the emergency management incident command, to have more communication. It's really important. We are seeing increased discussions between ourselves and the railroad companies over the last couple months. I know Councilmember Reich has been involved in several discussions along these lines, along with some of our staff. So we're seeing an increase, and of course the governor is demanding it.
Right. Well, and I would just say I really thank the governor for using his voice to stress the importance of these issues, and I think this resolution is absolutely the right thing to do. So thank you to you, Mr. Ranieri, for helping with this, and several other staff people, and of course the council members who are helping to author this. And I think the other piece, of course, is we have very active state legislators who have been very involved in identifying the issues, working with community around how to try to move forward in an agenda around these issues. And so these would be primarily our transportation leads, which from the city of Minneapolis, which have been Representative Frank Hornstein and Senator Scott Dibble, but I know there are many other legislators from around the metro area and from around the state who've been actively engaged on this. And so thank you to them as well for helping incredibly concerning issue to cities, to communities. And so thanks for my colleagues for putting this together.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know we're going to do a press event about this at 11:30 in the Rotunda, so we'll get into a little bit more detail. But this resolution means a lot to me. We've been working on it for a few months now, and I think this shows nicely how this role is shared across different levels of government. I originally moved to Minnesota as part of IBM, but for disaster recovery planning specifically. Planning is incredibly important. It mitigates risk and it helps us to be more resilient. That is the role I think we play at the city level, and communication is greatly needed. So I really liked, and as I was speaking with several lawmakers at the state level about this, I really liked the pieces that have come into this that are the city's role in this, because it's asking for enhanced communication, and that's incredibly needed. And Saturday morning, I was in Zumbrota for an event, and I overheard somebody speaking to a store clerk. They were one of the evacuated breakfast diners in one of the more recent spills, and it really reminded me that this is not just a Minneapolis issue. And so I'm so pleased to have all those state lawmakers in conversation. I know this needs to even go to the federal level, and I'm just pleased we've been able to get this together. I'd like to thank staff for helping us, particularly Mr. Ranieri and Mr. Conover.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember. Any further questions or conversation? I will add all the thanks that have been shared by the presenters and my colleagues. I want to echo. We certainly have gotten a significant amount of attention from our federal level representatives. Senator Frank, and most notably, was in the community up in Northeast in the Fire Hall Museum, one of the busier lines in the state, rolling by Exhibit A throughout that whole presentation and that whole conversation. There's no doubt that we were making something up. It was there. And as a matter of fact, I think that's one of the things that we're really trying to do here, is that these issues aren't abstractions. They certainly aren't in my neck of the woods, where we have 600 contiguous acres of rail activity. It's not new, but what is new is the volume of this activity and the nature of the stuff moving through it's got a whole level of complexity that we want to address. But we don't want to get lost in the complexity. And that's what I think we're trying to do here is we're addressing these issues, we're codifying them, we're moralizing, but we're also saying we want to move forward. And the best way to move forward is to move forward as partners and co-problem solvers with the rail companies. This is not a shot across the bow for endless antagonism between two parties. This is an invitation to have sincere peer-to-peer conversations. And in much of what we're asking from our jurisdictional partners is to more firmly bring the parties to the table and say cities and the citizens in cities are problem solvers. They're the face of the problem, but they're also the heart and soul of the solutions. The CARS community that has representatives here and also participate in a lot of the research on their own time to make sure that this is robust and meaningful to the citizens who have to live with this. And so it's a product of them as well, and I want to thank them for it. And I want to leave on a looking forward sort of note. With the communications we have city to city, a lot of that will be through activism. And it'll be through the activism of groups like CARS that don't look at themselves as a neighborhood group trying to say this is our issue and our issue alone. They're connecting with other municipalities in Wisconsin, other states, Iowa, etc. And if we can have a city by city, community by community conversation that brings us to a full, complete system-wide conversation, that's where we want to be. And I think that's where our solutions to our concerns will be found. So I really think the work that goes into this, it was no small task, but certainly worth doing. With that, I would like to move the resolution as presented. Any further conversation? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Dissenting nay. Thank you very much. That concludes our business and we are adjourned.